Our journey this evening begins in the 19th century. The air is thin in the Swiss Alps, mountain peaks pierce clouds like cathedral spires, and a man with a magnificent moustache sits hunched over a writing desk, his eyesight failing, scribbling notes that will shatter Western philosophy like a hammer through stained glass. His name, Friedrich Nietzsche. His mission, to explain why truth might be an illusion, why morality might be a cage, and why the death of God could be humanity's greatest liberation or its most terrifying crisis. Before we properly begin Nietzsche's story, just a brief thought. If these calm explorations of transformative ideas help you unwind, please consider taking a moment to like this video and subscribe. It genuinely helps other curious minds discover these stories. And we're always curious for your reflections. Let us know in the comments below what you think of Nietzsche's philosophy and which thinker or historical question you'd like us to explore in our next bedtime story. Now, Nietzsche gets thrown around a lot, sometimes as a nihilist, sometimes as a prophet, sometimes as a proto-fascist. But strip away the noise, and at its heart, his philosophy asks a radical question. What if everything we believe, God, morality, truth itself, is just a story humans invented to make existence bearable? Nietzsche spent his life chasing that terrifying possibility through migraines, loneliness, and finally madness. Of course, history took his ideas and twisted them in directions he never intended. Misquotations, Nazi appropriations, a sister who forged his work. But tonight, we're not here for the distortions. We're just here to meet the man behind the moustache. A brilliant, tormented, deeply misunderstood thinker who wanted us to create our own meaning. And now, as the day winds down, let's begin to trace the life and times of this radical philosopher. This is the bedtime history of Friedrich Nietzsche. The story begins in 1844 in the quiet village of Rücken, Germany, where church bells measured time and Lutheran piety hung in the air like morning mist. Here, in a modest parsonage beside the cemetery, a boy named Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche took his first breaths. His father, Karl Ludwig, was the village pastor, a gentle man whose sermons promised eternal comfort. Young Friedrich would spend his childhood among gravestones and hymns, never suspecting he'd one day declare God dead and morality a human invention. The parsonage hummed with reverent silence. Karl Ludwig prepared his Sunday sermons by candlelight, while little Friedrich played quietly among theological volumes, already learning that noise displeased the household's solemn rhythms. His mother, Franziska, kept the home spotless and the Bible close. The boy absorbed it all, the prayers, the rituals, the sense that eternity watched from just beyond the veil. Then came the rupture. In 1849, when Friedrich was just 4 years old, his father began suffering debilitating headaches and strange episodes of confusion. Within months, Karl Ludwig was dead, the cause listed vaguely as brain softening. The pastor who'd promised his congregation that God's ways were mysterious left behind a mystery his son would spend a lifetime trying to solve. The funeral was Friedrich's first real memory, one he'd revisit obsessively in later writings, his father's coffin being lowered into the same cemetery where the boy had played, the congregation singing hymns about resurrection while dirt fell on polished wood. Within the year, his younger brother Joseph died too, as if God had decided to collect the Nietzsche men wholesale. Friedrich, his sister Elizabeth, their mother, grandmother, and 2 maiden aunts were all that remained. The household that raised him was a feminine fortress of piety. 5 women in black dresses, maintaining respectability on a widow's pension, teaching the boy that propriety mattered more than happiness. Friedrich learned to be quiet, obedient, unfailingly polite. His schoolmates nicknamed him the Little Pastor for his earnest piety and habit of quoting scripture. He seemed destined to follow his father into the pulpit, carrying on the family tradition of explaining God's will to German villagers. At 14, he won admission to Schulpforta, one of Germany's most prestigious boarding schools, housed in a former Cistercian monastery. The irony would have pleased the older Nietzsche, the future anti-Christian educated in monastic halls. Pforta was rigorous, classical, designed to produce scholars and statesmen through relentless study of Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and German literature. The days began at 5, ended at 9, every hour accounted for. Nietzsche thrived. His essays on classical authors showed startling depth for a teenager. His Greek compositions earned praise from teachers twice his age. But it was more than intellectual achievement. At 40, he discovered something dangerous, the ancient world before Christianity, where tragedy was celebrated, suffering wasn't redemptive, and gods behaved like magnificent immoral forces of nature. He also discovered music. His piano compositions from these years reveal a romantic sensibility, all storm and yearning, quite unlike the proper Lutheran hymns of his childhood. He'd lose himself for hours in improvisation, his fingers finding emotions his carefully controlled demeanour never showed. Music became his first rebellion, permission to feel things Christianity considered prideful or unholy. The cracks in his faith began quietly. A teacher lent him Emerson's essays, full of American self-reliance and skepticism toward inherited religion. He read voraciously beyond the curriculum, sneaking books that questioned, doubted, challenged. His notebooks from age 16 show a mind beginning to interrogate its own certainties. Why did we believe what we believed? Because it was true, or because we'd been taught it? The distinction, once noticed, couldn't be ignored. By the time he graduated in 1864, Friedrich had become two people. Outwardly, he remained the respectful, high-achieving student his mother expected. His leaving certificate praised his character and scholarship in equal measure. But inwardly, something had shifted. The boy who'd wanted to be a pastor now wondered if pastors were lying. To their congregations, to themselves, maybe both. His mother, reading his graduation letter, wept with pride. Her son would study theology at Bonn, become a scholar of God's Word, perhaps rise to prominence in the church. She had no way of knowing that Friedrich had already begun the apostasy that would define his life. He was carrying the faith like a coat that no longer fit, waiting for the right moment to shrug it off entirely. In 1864, he left for university, carrying a trunk of books, a head full of Greek, and a heart beginning to suspect that the Christian certainties of his childhood might be beautiful lies. The quiet banks of the Saale River would see him only occasionally after that, the dutiful son returning between semesters, each visit revealing him a little more estranged from the world that raised him. The pastor's son was about to become philosophy's most dangerous heretic. The transformation would take years. The consequences would echo for centuries. University life would shatter what childhood had only begun to crack. Bonn, 1864. The university halls smelled of beer and ambition. Student dueling societies left scars on young men's cheeks as badges of honour. And 20-year-old Friedrich Nietzsche dove into academic life with characteristic intensity. He joined a fraternity, drank more than he should have, and tried to fit himself into the shape of a conventional theology student. It lasted exactly one semester. The problem was simple. He'd stopped believing. Not dramatically, not with some crisis of faith in a candlelit chapel, just quietly, the way a coat becomes threadbare. Gradually, then all at once. Sitting through lectures on biblical exegesis felt like watching adults argue about which fairy tale got the details right. His letters home grew carefully vague about his studies, full of reassurances that meant nothing. His mother sensed the drift. When Friedrich announced he was abandoning theology for philology, the study of ancient languages and texts, Franziska's reply was ice-wrapped in maternal concern. Philology wouldn't save souls. Philology wouldn't honour his father's memory. Philology was, she didn't quite say, a betrayal of everything the family stood for. Friedrich went anyway. In 1865, he followed his favourite professor, Friedrich Ritschl, to the University of Leipzig. If Bonn had been a test run at respectability, Leipzig became the laboratory where Nietzsche discovered what he was actually capable of. Ritschl, recognising genius when he saw it, gave the young student increasingly difficult texts to analyse. Nietzsche didn't just translate them, he tore into them like an archaeologist uncovering civilizations, finding patterns and meanings that had eluded scholars twice his age. Then came October 1865, a day Nietzsche would later describe as pivotal. Browsing a used bookshop in Leipzig, he stumbled across a worn copy of Arthur Schopenhauer's The World as Will and Representation. He bought it on impulse, carried it home, and read for 14 hours straight. By dawn, something fundamental had shifted. Schopenhauer's philosophy was magnificent pessimism. The world, he argued, was driven by a blind, insatiable will, an endless striving that brought nothing but suffering. Happiness was impossible. Existence was pain, punctuated by brief moments of aesthetic contemplation. The only escape was the extinction of desire itself, a kind of Buddhist negation Schopenhauer admired without fully understanding. To most readers, this was depressing. To Nietzsche, it was liberating. Here was a philosopher who looked at existence without Christian fairy tales, without promises of heavenly reward, and still found it worth examining. Schopenhauer became his first real teacher, the voice that confirmed what Nietzsche had suspected, that you could face life's meaninglessness and still think clearly about it. His academic work exploded with newfound energy. He published papers on ancient sources while still a student, work so sophisticated that other scholars assumed he was already a professor. Ritschl called him the most talented philologist he'd encountered in 40 years of teaching. When Leipzig's academic journal needed articles, they turned to the 22-year-old Nietzsche like he was an established authority. The trajectory seemed clear. Doctorate, professorship, respectable career mapping the syntax of dead languages. Then Prussia interrupted. In 1867, Nietzsche was conscripted for military service. He joined a mounted artillery unit, learned to ride horses badly, and within months suffered a serious chest injury mounting his horse. The army discharged him. Back to Leipzig he went, now with chronic pain added to the migraines that had started plaguing him. But the military interlude had one unexpected benefit. It bought him time. While recovering, he threw himself back into research with manic focus. His work on the Greek poet Theonis was so impressive that when the University of Basel needed a professor of classical philology in 1869, Ritschl's recommendation was unequivocal. This young man, he wrote, was a genius. Hire him immediately. Basel did, with one small problem. Nietzsche hadn't finished his doctorate. No matter. Leipzig granted him the degree without examination based on his published work alone. At 24 years old, Friedrich Nietzsche became the youngest professor of philology in Europe, skipping the usual decade of preparation entirely. The speed was dizzying. 5 years earlier, he'd been the pious teenager nicknamed Little Pastor. Now he was Professor Nietzsche, teaching Greek grammar to Swiss students who were often older than him. His mother wept again, this time with confused pride. A professor was respectable, at least. That her son had abandoned God to get there was a detail she tried not to dwell on. Nietzsche moved to Basel in April 1869, unpacked his books in a small apartment, and prepared his first lectures. The Swiss city was clean, orderly, breathtakingly dull. The mountains loomed nearby, promising escape, but escape would have to wait. By 1869, the young man who'd started university planning to become a respectable theologian had become philosophy's youngest full professor, armed with Schopenhauer's pessimism and a growing suspicion that Western civilization was built on comforting delusions. The stage was set. The audience, though they didn't know it yet, was about to be scandalized. But first, there was music, and a friendship that would end in madness and betrayal. Basel, November 1869. A young professor receives an invitation to visit Richard Wagner at his villa in Tribschen, perched above Lake Lucerne like a composer's fever dream. Nietzsche, just 25 and starstruck, makes the pilgrimage expecting to meet his hero. What he finds instead is something more dangerous. A father figure, a collaborator, and eventually a magnificent disappointment. Actually, they'd met once before, briefly, in Leipzig the previous year. Wagner had been in town and a mutual friend arranged an introduction. The encounter lasted minutes, long enough for Wagner to learn that this intense young philologist adored his music, and for Nietzsche to feel the full force of Wagner's charisma, that overwhelming presence that made you feel like the most important person in the room, while simultaneously aware that Wagner was the sun around which you orbited. The great composer had been gracious, distracted, already moving on to his next admirer. But now Wagner had invited him to Tribschen, the lakeside refuge where the composer lived with Cosima von Bülow, technically still married to conductor Hans von Bülow, actually Wagner's lover and soon to be his wife. The arrangement was scandalous. The villa was paradise. Picture it. A white house overlooking turquoise water, mountains rising like cathedral walls, the air clean and sharp after the coal smoke of German cities. Inside, Wagner held court. He was 56, at the height of his creative powers, working on the ring cycle while charming visitors, playing piano, expounding theories about art and culture and the German soul. Cosima, 24 years his junior, managed the household with aristocratic grace, keeping the maestro comfortable and the guests entertained. Nietzsche fell completely under the spell. Over the next 3 years, he would visit Tribschen 23 times, sometimes for an afternoon, sometimes for days. He became part of the household furniture, the brilliant young professor who could discuss Greek tragedy with authority and listen to Wagner's theories with flattering attention. For Wagner, Nietzsche was a useful admirer, educated, articulate, academically respectable. For Nietzsche, Wagner was the missing father, the artistic genius he'd been searching for since Schopenhauer. The Tribschen circle felt like the future of culture. Wagner was creating what he called Gesamtkunstwerk, total artwork, opera that combined music, poetry, stagecraft and myth into something that would transform German civilization. Art wasn't entertainment, it was redemption, a secular religion for a post-Christian age. Nietzsche, still trying to figure out what came after God died, found this intoxicating. He wrote essays defending Wagner to skeptical colleagues. He attended rehearsals, offering opinions on staging and interpretation. On Christmas morning 1870, he organised a surprise performance of Wagner's Siegfried Idyll outside the composer's bedroom, musicians playing while Cosima woke to her husband's music. It was the kind of grand romantic gesture that Nietzsche, usually so reserved, could only manage when swept up in someone else's vision. Meanwhile, history kept interrupting. In July 1870, France declared war on Prussia. Nietzsche, technically Swiss now but ethnically Prussian, felt obligated to serve. He couldn't fight, his Swiss citizenship and previous discharge made that impossible. But he could work as a medical orderly. He volunteered, received hasty training, and shipped out to the front. The Franco-Prussian War gave Nietzsche his only taste of violence up close. As a medical orderly, he tended wounded soldiers in makeshift field hospitals, where the floors ran red and the screams never stopped. He saw men with limbs shattered by artillery, faces burned by powder, intestines exposed to flies. The romantic notions about war's nobility that German culture celebrated revealed themselves as lies told by people who'd never smelled gangrene. He lasted weeks before his body quit. Dysentery and diphtheria struck simultaneously, turning his insides to water while his throat closed. They shipped him back to Germany more dead than alive, spending weeks recovering in Erlangen before returning to Basel in October, gaunt and shaken. The war continued without him. Germany won, united under Prussian leadership, and began the triumphalist nationalism that would haunt Europe for the next century. Back in Basel, Nietzsche tried to process what he'd witnessed. War wasn't glorious. Nationalism was becoming toxic, and German culture, for all Wagner's rhapsodizing about its superiority, had produced industrialized slaughter. These thoughts stayed private, tucked into notebooks while he prepared his lectures, and wrote the book that would make him infamous. The Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music appeared in January 1872. Its thesis was radical. Greek tragedy succeeded not through reason and order, the qualities German scholars had always celebrated, but through the collision of two opposing forces: Apollo, god of light and reason and beautiful forms, and Dionysus, god of wine and chaos and ecstatic dissolution of self. Tragedy's power came from holding these forces in tension, the structured art containing barely controlled madness. Modern culture, Nietzsche argued, had lost the Dionysian entirely. Christianity had taught people to fear instinct, passion, the body. The Enlightenment had worshipped reason to the point of sterility. Only Wagner, Nietzsche claimed, was recovering the Dionysian element that could make art dangerous and transformative again. The book ended with a barely concealed call to embrace Wagnerian opera as the rebirth of tragic culture. The academic establishment responded with horror. This wasn't proper philology. Where were the footnotes, the careful textual analysis, the modest accumulation of evidence? Nietzsche had written philosophy disguised as classical scholarship, mixing speculation with poetry, making grand pronouncements without proper academic caution. Worse, he'd praised a contemporary composer, breaching the wall between objective scholarship and aesthetic advocacy. The attacks came swiftly. Ulrich von Wilhelmowitz Müllendorf, a rising star in classical studies, published a devastatingly titled review, Future Philology. The exclamation point did most of the work. Wilamowitz accused Nietzsche of abandoning scholarship for prophecy, misunderstanding the Greeks, and generally embarrassing the field. Other reviews piled on. The book sold poorly. Students stopped enrolling in Nietzsche's classes, dropping from a respectable cohort to nearly zero. Wagner, of course, loved it. Finally, someone understood. He sent Nietzsche effusive letters of gratitude and showed the book to important cultural figures, trying to generate enthusiasm. But the damage to Nietzsche's academic reputation was real and lasting. At 27, he'd published a book that made him celebrated in artistic circles and professional poison in his own field. Through it all, his health was quietly deteriorating. The migraines that had begun in his student years were worsening, arriving with increasing frequency and severity. They'd start with visual distortions, shimmering lights, blind spots, then escalate to blinding pain that made reading impossible and thinking torture. He'd spend days in darkened rooms, waiting for the agony to pass. His eyesight was weakening, requiring him to hold books inches from his face. Nausea arrived unpredictably, forcing him to excuse himself from lectures to vomit. The doctors had no answers. Some blamed heredity, his father's mysterious brain illness casting shadows. Others suggested overwork, recommending rest that never seemed to help. Nietzsche tried various remedies: cold compresses, dietary changes, avoiding wine, drinking more wine. Nothing worked consistently. He was learning to function despite constant physical suffering, writing between attacks, teaching through low-grade pain. Wagner noticed, but didn't particularly care. The great composer was self-absorbed by temperament and focused on his own creations. When Nietzsche visited Tribschen complaining of illness, Wagner would commiserate briefly before redirecting conversation to the ring cycle's progress or his theories about racial purity in art, a topic that made Nietzsche increasingly uncomfortable. Because something else was emerging from those Tribschen visits, the realization that Wagner's vision of German culture had dark undercurrents. The composer's anti-Semitism, initially dismissed as common prejudice, revealed itself as central to his worldview. Wagner believed Jewish composers were incapable of true art, that their foreign sensibility corrupted German culture. He said this casually, as obvious fact, expecting agreement. Nietzsche, who'd grown up in a household without particular prejudice, and whose academic training taught him to value ideas regardless of their source, found this repellent. But he was 25, infatuated with his artistic father figure, and skilled at rationalizing what he didn't want to see. He told himself Wagner's prejudices were unfortunate, but separate from his artistic genius. He told himself wrong. The Tribschen idyll was beginning to crack, though neither party acknowledged it yet. Nietzsche kept visiting, kept defending Wagner publicly, kept trying to be the dutiful disciple. But his notebooks show a mind beginning to question, to notice contradictions, to wonder if his hero might be something more complicated and less admirable than he'd imagined. In 1872, Wagner left Tribschen for Bayreuth, where he planned to build a festival theatre dedicated to performing his works. The villa on Lake Lucerne stood empty. Nietzsche, visiting the vacant house one last time, stood at the window overlooking the water and felt the melancholy of an era ending. The next chapter of their relationship would be darker, stranger, and ultimately unendurable. But for now, walking back to Basel in the mountain air, Nietzsche had published his first book, survived his first academic scandal, and was beginning to understand that health, reputation, and comfortable certainties were all things you could lose. The birth of tragedy had made him infamous in philology departments and celebrated in artistic circles. Exactly the wrong kind of attention for a young professor who still needed to teach Greek grammar. His health was deteriorating, his academic reputation crumbling, and his greatest friendship was about to curdle into bitter estrangement. Something had to break. By 1876, it did. Bayreuth, August 1876. The first Wagner festival was everything Richard Wagner had dreamed of, a temple to Germanic myth, attended by Kaisers and cultured elite, celebrating the composer's triumph. Nietzsche, sitting in the audience with a pounding migraine, felt nothing but revulsion. The crowd's nationalism, the spectacle's grandiosity, Wagner's self-aggrandizement, it all suddenly seemed like the opposite of everything art should be. After the third day, he fled to a nearby forest and sat alone among the trees trying to understand what had just broken inside him. The festival was meant to be Wagner's vindication. For years, the composer had struggled to find theatres willing to stage his massive operas. So he'd built his own theatre in Bayreuth, designed specifically for the Ring cycle, funded by wealthy patrons who believed they were supporting the rebirth of German art. Opening night drew German Emperor Wilhelm I, King Ludwig II of Bavaria, and everyone who mattered in European culture. Nietzsche had attended out of duty and dwindling affection. What he found horrified him. The audience wasn't experiencing transcendent art. They were performing nationalist ritual. Between acts, they congratulated each other on German cultural superiority. They praised Wagner not for his music, but for being properly German, properly anti-foreign, properly committed to racial purity in art. The composer had become a mascot for everything Nietzsche was learning to despise, herd mentality dressed as cultural sophistication. And the music itself, had it always been this bombastic, this manipulative? Wagner's leitmotifs, those recurring musical themes, now struck Nietzsche as emotional bullying, telling the audience what to feel rather than letting them discover feeling organically. The whole spectacle reeked of calculation, of a brilliant man who'd discovered he could control crowds through carefully orchestrated beauty. Worse was Parsifal. Wagner's final opera, still unfinished but already sketched out, would tell the story of the Holy Grail, Christian redemption, and the renunciation of earthly desire. Wagner described it with religious fervour, this opera that would heal Germany's spiritual wounds through Christian mythology. Nietzsche, listening to Wagner expound on Parsifal's themes, felt something die. The composer who'd once seemed to transcend Christianity was crawling back into its arms, wrapping himself in crosses and redemption narratives like they were warm blankets against mortality's chill. The break wasn't sudden. Nietzsche didn't storm out or write an angry letter. He simply stopped visiting, stopped answering Wagner's correspondence promptly, let the friendship cool through studied neglect. Wagner, absorbed in his festival's success and planning future productions, barely noticed. By the time either man acknowledged the estrangement, it was years old and irreversible. Back in Basel, Nietzsche channeled his disillusionment into a series of essays he called Untimely Meditations. Published between 1873 and 1876, they were supposedly about various cultural topics: German education, Schopenhauer, history's uses and abuses. But anyone reading carefully could detect the subtext: a young philosopher working out his frustration with contemporary culture, especially its nationalistic self-satisfaction. The fourth meditation, Richard Wagner in Bayreuth, appeared just before the festival. On the surface, it praised Wagner. Between the lines, it raised questions about whether great artists might become corrupted by success, whether genius could curdle into mere celebrity. Wagner, reading it, sensed the ambivalence but chose to interpret it generously. He had bigger concerns: theatres to fill, patrons to cultivate, an empire to build. Meanwhile, Nietzsche's body was staging its own rebellion. The migraines intensified to the point where he could barely teach. His eyesight worsened so dramatically that reading became torture, requiring magnifying glasses and special lighting. Digestive problems joined the symptoms: violent nausea, stomach cramps, days of debilitating weakness. Some days he couldn't leave his bed. Others he'd force himself to lecture, then collapse afterward in his rooms. The university administration grew concerned. Professor Nietzsche was brilliant but increasingly unreliable, missing classes, looking gaunt and haunted when he did appear. His student enrollment had never recovered from the birth of tragedy scandal, and now his health made him seem like a risky investment. In 1879, after a particularly brutal stretch of illness, Nietzsche submitted his resignation. He was 34 years old. Basel granted him a modest pension, 3,000 Swiss francs annually, barely enough to live on if he stayed in cheap boarding houses and avoided luxuries. For the rest of his life, Nietzsche would exist in financial precarity, dependent on this small income, supplemented by occasional gifts from his mother and sister. The promising young professor had become a voluntary invalid, trading security for the freedom to think and write without institutional constraints. But freedom, it turned out, could be desperately lonely. Nietzsche began his nomadic existence, moving between Swiss and Italian cities based on which climate might help his migraines. Sils Maria in summer for the thin mountain air, Nice or Genoa in winter for warmth and sun, Turin eventually, for reasons he could never quite articulate beyond the quality of the light. He travelled alone, lived alone, wrote alone. Then, in April 1882, Lou Salome walked into his life and detonated what little remained of his domestic hopes. Lou was 21, Russian, brilliant, and committed to remaining unmarried. She'd come to Rome to study with a philosopher named Paul Rée, who'd become Nietzsche's friend through correspondence about morality and pessimism. Rée introduced Lou and Nietzsche at St. Peter's Basilica, probably the most ironic location possible for the anti-Christian philosopher to fall in love. The attraction was instant and mutual, intellectually at least. Lou had read Nietzsche's books and wanted to study with him. Nietzsche, encountering a woman who could discuss philosophy as an intellectual equal rather than a curiosity, felt something he'd mostly suppressed: romantic desire. Within weeks, he was proposing marriage. Lou declined. Marriage, she explained, was a trap that would destroy her intellectual independence. She wanted to study, think, write, activities that respectable married women couldn't pursue seriously. But she suggested an alternative. What if she, Nietzsche, and Rée lived together as intellectual companions? A kind of philosophical commune, pursuing truth without bourgeois romantic entanglements? Nietzsche, desperate and rationalizing, wildly agreed. The plan was absurd on its face. A young woman living unmarried with two single men in 1882 Europe. Scandal was guaranteed. But for a few months they pretended it could work. They rented a house together briefly in Teutoburg, Germany, where they read, debated, took long walks discussing morality and metaphysics. A famous photograph from this period captures the doomed arrangement's spirit. Lou sits in a mock cart, holding a whip decorated with lilacs. Nietzsche and Rée are posed as if pulling the cart, yoked like draft animals. Lou staged it as a joke about their intellectual dynamic. Nietzsche's sister Elizabeth, viewing it later, saw proof of Lou's manipulative cruelty. The truth was probably simpler. Three intelligent people playing at unconventional relationships without quite understanding what they were doing. It fell apart quickly. Rée was in love with Lou too, though he hid it better. Nietzsche oscillated between intellectual companionship and desperate marriage proposals Lou kept declining. Elizabeth, horrified by the whole arrangement, wrote poisonous letters calling Lou a predatory adventuress. The gossip reached their mother, who was mortified. By autumn, the philosophical commune had dissolved into acrimony and hurt feelings. Lou eventually left both men, went to Berlin, and became a successful writer and one of Freud's most important students. Rée remained friends with her for years. Nietzsche never spoke to her again, nursing wounds he'd disguise as philosophical insights about women's nature. His writings about women, never enlightened, took on a bitter edge after Lou. Dismissive, sometimes contemptuous observations that revealed more about his pain than about women themselves. The failed romance crystallized something Nietzsche had been resisting. He would be alone. Not temporarily, not until the right person came along, but permanently. His health made him impossible to live with. His ideas made him professionally toxic. His personality, intense, demanding, humorless about his work, wasn't built for domestic harmony. Marriage proposals to other women over the years met similar rejections until he stopped asking. His sister Elizabeth stepped into the vacuum. She'd always been involved in his life, managing correspondence and practical matters when his health failed. But after the Lou Salome disaster, she positioned herself as his primary relationship, his defender against women who didn't appreciate his genius. The dynamic was unhealthy in ways neither acknowledged, Friedrich dependent and resentful, Elizabeth controlling and self-righteous. In 1885, Elizabeth married Bernhard Förster, a prominent anti-Semite who'd been fired from his teaching position for agitating against Jewish students. Nietzsche was appalled. He'd spent years arguing with Elizabeth about her prejudices, trying to make her understand that anti-Semitism was contemptible, the refuge of mediocre minds looking for scapegoats. Now she was marrying its embodiment. The wedding was cold. Förster and Elizabeth announced plans to found Nueva Germania, an Aryan colony in Paraguay where proper German families could live free from Jewish and indigenous contamination. They sailed in 1886, leaving Nietzsche relieved by the distance and horrified by the project. His letters to Elizabeth during her Paraguay years mixed fraternal concern with barely concealed contempt for her husband's racial fantasies. By 1879, Nietzsche had lost his professorship, his health, his great friendship, and any hope of conventional domestic happiness. What he gained in return was something more dangerous, absolute freedom to think whatever he wanted, write whatever he pleased, and follow his ideas into territories no philosopher had dared explore. The wandering years were about to begin, and in those wanderings he would write the books that would make him immortal, even if almost nobody read them. For the next decade, Nietzsche became a ghost haunting European boarding houses, summers in the Swiss Alps at Sils Maria, where the thin air helped his migraines, winters on the Italian Riviera, Nice, Genoa, Turin, chasing warmth for his failing health. He travelled with a small trunk of books, bottles of chloral hydrate and opium for the pain, and manuscripts nobody wanted to publish. His routine was monastic: wake before dawn, write for exactly 3 hours until his eyes gave out, walk for hours regardless of weather, sleep fitfully through afternoons of blinding pain. The geography of his exile followed a simple logic: altitude in summer, sea level in winter, cheap lodgings always. Sils Maria offered mountain air at 6,000 feet, crystalline and thin, which somehow reduced the frequency of his headaches. He'd rent the same modest rooms each summer from a local family, barely furnished, smelling of wood smoke and alpine flowers. His window overlooked meadows where he'd walk in the afternoons, composing thoughts that would appear in his books months or years later. Winters demanded warmth. The Italian Riviera became his refuge, though refuge was perhaps too comfortable a word for the shabby pensions where he stayed. Nice first, drawn by its reputation for mild climate. He'd rent rooms in the old town, away from the fashionable hotels where wealthy invalids took the sea air. His landlords remembered him as the quiet German professor who paid on time, ate little, and could be heard pacing overhead at odd hours. The daily routine never varied because his body wouldn't permit variation. 4 in the morning he'd wake in darkness, light a candle and begin writing. His eyesight was so poor now that he worked with his nose nearly touching the page, scribbling in notebooks with a pencil, because ink was harder to see. By 7, his eyes would be burning, vision blurring, and he'd have to stop whether the thought was finished or not. Breakfast was sparse: bread, perhaps an egg, weak tea. Coffee had joined the list of forbidden substances after he discovered it triggered migraines. Then came the walking, hours of it, through alpine meadows or along Mediterranean promenades. Walking was the only thing that helped, movement somehow dulling the pain, or at least distracting him from it. He walked regardless of weather, through rain and snow, muttering to himself, working through philosophical problems with his feet. Local residents must have thought him eccentric. The German professor who walked for 6 hours straight, talking to himself, occasionally stopping to scribble notes in a small book he carried. He avoided conversation, claimed his Italian was poor though it wasn't, and cultivated the air of someone who didn't wish to be disturbed. Mostly people obliged. Afternoons were for suffering. The migraines, if they came, arrived after noon. He'd retreat to his darkened room, lie perfectly still and wait for the pain to pass. Sometimes it lasted hours, sometimes days. He described them in letters as nailing him to his bed, waves of agony punctuated by violent vomiting. His medication, chloral hydrate mostly, opium occasionally, dulled the edges but never erased the pain. He was learning to function as a semi-invalid, measuring his life in 3-hour increments of productivity between attacks. Through it all, he was writing books that nobody read. Human, All Too Human appeared in 878, the same year he resigned from Basel. The title announced a program, bringing philosophy down from metaphysical clouds to examine human nature as it actually was, not as religion or idealism claimed it should be. The book was divided into short-numbered sections, aphorisms, observations, arguments compressed into a few paragraphs each. It was a new style for Nietzsche, developed partly from reading French moralists, partly from necessity. When you could only work 3 hours daily and your thoughts came in fragments interrupted by pain, the aphorism became the natural form. The content was explosive, though almost nobody noticed. Nietzsche attacked everything he'd previously believed. Metaphysics was shown as wishful thinking dressed as truth. Morality wasn't handed down by God or discovered through reason, but invented by humans for very human purposes, usually to control others or feel superior. Even Schopenhauer, his former hero, came under scrutiny. The great pessimist's philosophy was revealed as just another comfort, another way to avoid facing existence honestly. And Wagner, though Nietzsche never named him directly, everyone who knew their history understood. This section on artists who become self-parodying, celebrities, on music that manipulates rather than moves, on German nationalism disguised as cultural sophistication. It was a 500-page breakup letter disguised as philosophy. The book sold fewer than 500 copies in its first year. Reviews were scarce and confused. Academic philosophers ignored it as the work of a former philologist who'd lost his way. His former supporters from the Wagner circle felt betrayed. His mother wrote concerned letters asking if he was becoming too negative. Nietzsche, reading the sales figures from his boarding house in Geneva, felt vindicated in his loneliness. Of course, the herd didn't understand. He was writing for readers who didn't exist yet, for a future that might be decades away. Financial survival was a constant preoccupation. His pension of 3,000 francs annually was enough if he lived carefully. Cheap rooms, simple food, no luxuries beyond books and postage. He tracked every expense in notebooks, calculating how much he could afford to spend on paper, on medication, on the occasional restaurant meal that broke the monotony of boarding house food. Publishing his books meant paying for printing himself, since no publisher would take the financial risk. Each book represented months of savings sacrificed on the altar of getting ideas into print. His mother sometimes sent money, accompanied by worried letters about his health and his soul. His sister Elizabeth, before her departure for Paraguay, had helped with correspondence and practical matters, though her departure brought more relief than loss. Friends contributed occasionally. Peter Gast, a young composer who'd become his assistant, helped prepare manuscripts when Nietzsche's eyesight made editing impossible. But mostly he was alone, dependent on his pension, and slowly depleting his mother's gifts. The isolation was nearly total. He'd go days without speaking to anyone beyond ordering food or greeting his landlord. Letters became his primary human contact, correspondence with a small circle who tolerated his intensity and irregular responses. He wrote to his mother dutifully, to Gast frequently, to scattered friends and former students when his health permitted. The letters mixed philosophy with mundane complaints about weather, food, pain, a record of someone trying to maintain human connection while living like a hermit. Yet somehow, impossibly, he kept producing books. Daybreak appeared in 1881, continuing the aphoristic assault on conventional morality. Its subtitle, Thoughts on Moral Prejudices. Nietzsche argued that our moral judgments weren't noble commitments to truth, but often disguised expressions of power, resentment, or fear. Christian morality especially came under scrutiny as a system designed to make suffering feel meaningful, to convince the weak that their weakness was actually spiritual strength. The book sold even worse than Human, all too human, just 66 copies in its first year. Nietzsche, informed of this by his publisher, laughed bitterly. He was creating philosophical time bombs that would explode decades after his death, if they exploded at all. The present had no use for him. Then came the gay science in 1882, and with it, ideas that would define his legacy. The title was deliberately provocative, gay in its older sense of joyful, but also playing with connotations of light-heartedness in the face of terrible truths. This was philosophy as affirmation, as saying yes to existence despite everything. Buried in section 125 was the famous parable. A madman running through a marketplace, lighting a lantern in broad daylight, screaming, "I seek God! I seek God!" The crowd mocks him. He smashes the lantern and announces, "God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him." The people don't understand. They've killed God through science and rationality, but haven't grasped the implications, that every value derived from Christian metaphysics is now ungrounded. That meaning itself must be recreated from nothing. Another section introduced eternal recurrence, though tentatively. What if you had to live your exact life over and over, infinitely, every pain and joy and mundane moment repeated eternally? Would you curse existence or love your fate? The idea wasn't meant as metaphysics. Nietzsche didn't care if it was literally true. It was a thought experiment, a test. Could you affirm your life so completely that you'd want it repeated forever, exactly as it was? The gay science sold no better than his previous books. Europe was uninterested in declarations of God's death or thought experiments about eternal return. Nietzsche was writing into a void, accumulating boxes of unsold books in his rented rooms, using them as furniture when he ran out of shelves. His health, if possible, worsened further. The migraines were now accompanied by digestive crises that left him unable to eat for days. His eyesight required him to dictate passages to friends when editing was necessary. Periodic rumours of his death circulated among those who'd known him in Basel, not entirely inaccurate given how close he lived to the edge. But he refused to stop. Writing became the one thing that justified the suffering, the poverty, the loneliness. He was documenting the death of an entire moral worldview and trying to imagine what came after. Someone had to do it. That nobody was listening only proved his diagnosis correct. The herd couldn't hear truths that threatened their comfort. In that decade of wandering, writing to an audience that didn't exist, Nietzsche produced some of philosophy's most radical ideas. God was dead. Truth was perspectival. Morality was a power game invented by the weak to control the strong. And nobody noticed. The books gathered dust in warehouses while their author walked alone through alpine meadows and Italian streets, composing manifestos for a future that hadn't arrived yet. Then, in 1883, he sat down to write something different, something strange, something that would either be dismissed as nonsense or recognized as genius, though he was increasingly uncertain which or whether the distinction even mattered. Sils Maria, summer 1883. Beside a massive pyramidal boulder overlooking a turquoise alpine lake, Nietzsche experiences what he later calls 6,000 feet beyond man and time. He's walking as always when the idea hits him like lightning-splitting rock. What if you had to live your entire life over and over again, eternally, every moment exactly the same? Every joy, every pain, every trivial breakfast, every migraine, every failed relationship, repeated infinitely in perfect detail. Would you curse the universe, or would you learn to love your fate so completely that you'd choose this eternal return? The question wasn't academic. Standing there on the path near the Soleil Rock, Nietzsche felt the idea's full weight. If existence is meaningless, if there's no divine purpose or cosmic justice, then life's value depends entirely on your ability to affirm it, to say yes to everything it contains. Eternal recurrence wasn't a claim about physics or metaphysics. He didn't care whether time literally repeated. It was a test, a thought experiment that sorted people into two categories: those who could embrace existence completely and those who secretly wished they'd never been born. From that vision, walking back to his boarding house in a kind of ecstatic daze, came the book that would consume him for the next 2 years. Thus Spoke Zarathustra would be unlike anything in Western philosophy. Part poem, part prophecy, part parody of the Bible. It wouldn't argue. It would proclaim, seduce, provoke. The philosopher who'd spent a decade writing careful aphorisms was about to write something deliberately, outrageously excessive. The first part poured out in 10 days of manic productivity that February. Nietzsche barely slept, barely ate, writing in a fever that felt like possession. His handwriting grew wilder as he raced to capture thoughts arriving faster than his pen could move. He'd wake at 3 in the morning with complete passages in his head, scramble for paper, scribble until dawn. By mid-February he had a manuscript, Part 1 of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The book's structure deliberately echoed the Gospels. Zarathustra, named for the ancient Persian prophet, descends from his mountain cave after 10 years of solitude. He's 30 years old, Christ's age when he began teaching. He comes bearing a message not of salvation but of self-overcoming, of humanity's need to surpass itself. The parody was intentional, even down to the archaic biblical language Nietzsche employed. This was scripture for a post-Christian age, gospel for those who'd outgrown God. The opening scene set the tone. Zarathustra descends to the marketplace and announces to the crowd, "I teach you the Übermensch. Man is something to be overcome. What have you done to overcome him?" The crowd doesn't understand. They think he's promising a better version of current humanity, more comfortable and secure. Zarathustra, frustrated, tries another approach. He warns them about the last man, the ultimate human evolution toward absolute mediocrity, where everyone wants comfort and no one wants greatness. "We have invented happiness," the last man says and blinks. The crowd loves this vision. Comfort, security, happiness. They want to become last men immediately. Zarathustra, realizing the masses can't understand his teaching, abandons the marketplace. If humanity won't evolve collectively, perhaps a few exceptional individuals can transform themselves into something higher. The Übermensch isn't a biological prophecy, but a philosophical challenge. Become who you are, create your own values, affirm life so completely that you'd choose eternal recurrence. Nietzsche worked the word Übermensch carefully, knowing it would be misunderstood. It didn't mean Superman in the comic book sense, nor did it imply biological superiority or Aryan racial purity, concepts Nietzsche explicitly despised. The Übermensch was an ideal of human potential, someone who'd created meaning in a meaningless universe, who'd overcome resentment and nihilism, who could say yes to existence without need for cosmic justification. It was aspiration, not destination. Even Zarathustra wasn't the Übermensch, but merely his prophet, the herald of a possibility. Part 2 arrived that same summer, another burst of composition in Sils Maria. Zarathustra continues teaching, this time to disciples who've gathered in his mountain cave. He speaks about will to power, not political power or domination, though it would be catastrophically misread that way, but life's fundamental drive to grow, overcome resistance, create. Everything alive sought not mere survival, but flourishing, expansion, self-overcoming. Even suffering could be affirmed if it led to growth. The style was biblical pastiche mixed with romantic poetry, full of verily I say unto you, and hearken unto me. It was pompous, deliberately so. Nietzsche was mocking religious proclamation while secretly depending on its rhythms and power. The book danced between sincerity and self-parody, between earnest teaching and ironic performance. Readers never knew quite how to take it, which was precisely the point. Part 3 came in 1884, written in Nice during a particularly brutal stretch of illness. This section was darker, exploring what happens when Zarathustra faces his own disgust with humanity, his temptation toward contempt. Could you really affirm existence that included so much pettiness, so much deliberate mediocrity? The book's climax came when Zarathustra confronts the eternal recurrence directly, in all its terrible weight. His animals tell him, everything goes, everything comes back, eternally rolls the wheel of being. Zarathustra must learn to love even this, even the eternal return of everything he despises. By now, Nietzsche was convinced. He'd written something epical. He wrote to friends claiming Zarathustra was the deepest book in German, perhaps in any language. His letters took on a grandiose tone that worried those who received them. Was this confidence or something darker, the first signs of the megalomania that would consume him? Part 4 arrived in 1885, and here the project's commercial reality became unavoidable. His publisher, having watched the first 3 parts sell poorly, refused to publish the 4th. Nietzsche, convinced the book needed completion, paid for a private printing himself. 40 copies total, the minimum the printer would produce. He gave away most of them to friends and kept a few copies for himself, bound copies of a book almost nobody would read. Part 4 was strange even by Zarathustra's standards. A parade of broken seekers arrives at Zarathustra's cave. A pope whose god has died, a magician who's lost faith in his tricks, kings disgusted by democracy, scholars who've discovered too much. They're all higher men, people who've outgrown conventional beliefs but don't know what comes next. Zarathustra teaches them about amor fati, love of fate, and tries to show them how to affirm existence. It ends ambiguously, with Zarathustra preparing to descend again, his work unfinished, his teaching ongoing. The book's language was intoxicating and infuriating in equal measure. Man is a rope stretched between animal and Übermensch, a rope over an abyss. That which does not kill me makes me stronger. One must have chaos within oneself to give birth to a dancing star. These phrases would be quoted endlessly, usually stripped of context, turned into motivational slogans or fascist dogma or self-help platitudes, everything Nietzsche hadn't intended. Reading it was exhausting. The prose rose and fell like mountain terrain, difficult passages followed by crystalline insights, poetry mixed with polemic. There was no argument in the traditional sense, no systematic philosophy to extract. It was meant to be experienced, to transform readers through style as much as content. Most readers simply gave up. Those who persisted often misunderstood spectacularly. The sales figures told their own story. Part 1 sold perhaps 250 copies in its first year. Part 2 even fewer. Part 3 barely registered. Part 4's 40-copy print run meant it essentially didn't exist commercially. Nietzsche had spent 3 years writing what he considered his masterpiece, and the German reading public responded with profound indifference. His conviction never wavered. In letters, he called Zarathustra the fifth gospel, the most important book since the original four. He claimed it would divide history into before and after, that future generations would date events from its publication. Friends receiving these letters exchanged worried glances. The brilliant philosopher was sounding unhinged. But Nietzsche knew something his contemporaries didn't. He was writing for the future, for readers who didn't exist yet but would eventually. The book's difficulty was intentional, meant to filter out those who wanted easy answers. Only readers willing to struggle, to question, to potentially transform themselves would persist. The rest would fall away naturally, which was exactly as it should be. Picture him in his boarding house room surrounded by those 40 copies of Part 4 he couldn't sell or give away, using them to prop up furniture, a makeshift table made of unread scripture. The absurdity must have struck him. The prophet with no followers, the teacher with no students, the revolutionary whose revolution hadn't started, and yet he was oddly content. He'd said what needed saying, planted seeds that might sprout decades after his death. The book's final image was telling. After all the teaching, all the proclamations about overcoming humanity and eternal recurrence, Zarathustra sees a sunrise and understands, "This is my morning, my day begins. Rise now, rise, great noon." The work was finished. Or rather, the preparation was finished. The real transformation still lay ahead, both for Zarathustra and for the culture Nietzsche was trying to address. Thus Spoke Zarathustra was meant to revolutionize philosophy, replace religious morality with life-affirming values, and announce the arrival of a new type of human being. Instead, it sat unread in Nietzsche's room while he paid rent with his meagre pension and planned his next books. The prophet had spoken to an empty auditorium, proclaiming truths nobody wanted to hear, but the prophet, stubborn as mountain stone and just as immovable, wasn't done yet. If Zarathustra was poetry, his next books would be dynamite, or at least that's what he'd claim. Time to stop preaching and start demolishing. By 1886, Nietzsche had stopped being polite. If his earlier books whispered subversions, his late works screamed them. Beyond Good and Evil announced its intentions in the title alone. Morality, as traditionally understood, was a cage, and Nietzsche was bringing a sledgehammer. Philosophizing with a hammer, he called it, testing every idol to see if it rang hollow. They all did. The book appeared in 1886, funded once again from his own dwindling savings. Publishers had learned their lesson after Zarathustra's commercial failure. If Nietzsche wanted to publish philosophy that nobody would buy, he could pay for the privilege himself. The printing cost 300 francs, a month's pension, sacrifice so the world could ignore another book. Beyond Good and Evil was structured as a series of aphorisms and essays, returning to the style he'd developed in Human, all too human, but with ferocity replacing the earlier work's cool analysis. Nietzsche attacked everything, philosophers for their dogmatism, scientists for their naive faith in objective truth, moralists for their cowardice disguised as virtue. The book's central claim was devastating. There was no universal morality, only different, value systems serving different needs. He distinguished between master morality and slave morality, concepts that would be catastrophically misunderstood by later readers. Master morality, Nietzsche argued, came from the strong, who defined good as what they themselves were, powerful, creative, self-affirming. Slave morality emerged from the weak, who couldn't compete directly and so redefined morality itself. They called the strong evil, declared their own weakness good, and built entire religions around celebrating suffering and meekness. Christianity was slave morality's greatest triumph, a complete inversion of values that made humility divine and pride sinful. The analysis was subtle, nuanced, easily distorted. Nietzsche wasn't praising cruelty or advocating for aristocratic privilege. He was diagnosing how moral systems served psychological needs, how resentment could disguise itself as virtue. But subtlety would be the first casualty when his books finally found readers. On the Genealogy of Morality followed in 887, Nietzsche's most systematic work. 3 connected essays traced the origins of moral concepts: good and evil, guilt and conscience, the ascetic ideal. The writing was sharp, precise, marshalling historical and linguistic evidence to show how contemporary morality had evolved from very different ancient values. The first essay explored how good, originally meant noble or aristocratic, while bad simply meant common or low. Then came what Nietzsche called the slave revolt in morality, when the powerless priests and oppressed masses redefined everything. They couldn't defeat the powerful directly, so they poisoned the well, declaring the powerful evil and themselves good. Resentment in French, a word Nietzsche preferred for its overtones of festering grievance, became creative, inventing new values to cope with powerlessness. The second essay examined guilt, which Nietzsche traced to debt. Our concepts of conscience and bad conscience emerged from the literal debts humans owed to their ancestors, to their tribes, eventually to God. The internalization of punishment, making people feel guilty rather than simply punishing their bodies, was how civilization tamed humans, but also how it made them sick, neurotic, turned inward against themselves. The third essay took on the ascetic ideal, the worldwide tendency to deny life, body, pleasure in pursuit of some higher truth or spiritual goal. Christianity embodied this completely, but even atheist scientists pursued asceticism through their faith in objective truth. The ascetic ideal's persistence revealed something troubling. Humans would rather will nothingness than not will at all. Meaning mattered more than happiness, even if that meaning came from denying everything that made life worth living. The book sold 600 copies in its first year, Nietzsche's best showing yet. Still a commercial failure, still ignored by mainstream philosophy, but enough to keep his publisher marginally interested. Then came 1888, Nietzsche's final productive year, and something shifted. His health, paradoxically, improved slightly, or perhaps he'd learned to work through the pain more effectively. His productivity exploded. Between January and December, he completed 4 major books and began a 5th. The writing took on a manic edge, grandiose claims mixed with genuine insight, brilliance shadowed by something darker. The Case of Wagner appeared in May, finally making the break with his former friend explicit and public. Nietzsche accused Wagner of decadence, of making music that manipulated rather than elevated, of wrapping German nationalism in beautiful melodies. The composer had died in 1883, making the attack feel petty to some readers. But Nietzsche wasn't settling scores. He was diagnosing a cultural sickness, using Wagner as the most visible symptom of Europe's exhaustion. Twilight of the Idols came next, written in just a few weeks that autumn. The subtitle said it all: How to Philosophize with a Hammer. Each chapter was a controlled demolition. Socrates revealed as decadent, Plato as escapist, Christianity as life-denying. The writing crackled with energy, aphorisms so compressed they felt like explosions. What does not kill me makes me stronger appeared here, destined to be quoted out of context forever. The Antichrist, finished in September, was Nietzsche's frontal assault on Christianity. Not the usual academic critique, but something visceral, personal, furious. He called Christianity the one great curse, the one immortal blemish on humanity. The religion of pity had weakened Europe, made suffering seem redemptive, taught people to hate life and hope for death. The book's venom would ensure it stayed unpublished until after Nietzsche's collapse. No publisher would touch it while he was alive. And finally, in November, he completed Ecce Homo, an autobiography so bizarre it read like fever dream or elaborate joke. Chapter titles included Why I'm So Wise, Why I'm So Clever, and Why I Write Such Good Books. Each section mixed genuine reflection with grandiose self-assessment bordering on megalomania. He claimed, Thus Spoke Zarathustra was the deepest book ever written. He predicted his name would be associated with a crisis without equal on earth. His letters from this period matched the book's tone. He wrote to friends claiming he'd just split human history in 2. He called himself a destiny. The megalomania that had always lurked in his conviction of genius was breaking through the surface, no longer tempered by irony or self-awareness. Through all this productivity, his physical condition remained precarious. His eyesight was nearly gone, requiring him to write with his face nearly touching the page. The migraines continued their regular assaults. He developed tremors in his hands. But somehow, impossibly, the writing kept flowing, brilliant, unhinged, prophetic, disturbed. By late 1888, Nietzsche had completed his life's work. 7 major books written in 3 years, dozens of concepts coined, an entire moral system dismantled and rebuilt. His eyesight was nearly gone, his headaches unrelenting, his loneliness absolute. He'd printed the Antichrist at his own expense and sent copies to friends who responded with worried silence. The philosopher who'd declared "what doesn't kill me makes me stronger" was about to discover the exception to his own rule. Turin, January 3rd, 1889. A January morning that would change everything, or end everything depending on how you looked at it. Turin, January 1889. Nietzsche is happier than he's been in years. The Italian city's clear winter light agrees with his eyes. The cheap trattoria near his boarding house serves decent minestrone, and he's just finished Ecce Homo, his intellectual autobiography. His letters to friends bubble with uncharacteristic joy. "I am writing the history of the next 2 centuries." He signs them increasingly strangely, sometimes as Nietzsche, sometimes as the Crucified, sometimes simply as Dionysus. Nobody notices, or those who do dismiss it as philosophical playfulness. The last weeks of December had been strangely productive and peaceful. He walked the arcaded streets of Turin for hours, admiring the city's Baroque architecture, occasionally stopping at cafes for weak tea and writing notes in his small notebook. His landlords, the Fino family, found him courteous, quiet, paying his rent on time. Just another German professor taking the Italian air for his health. His letters from this period tell a different story. On December 27th, he wrote to his old friend Franz Overbeck in Basel, "Actually, I would much rather be a Basel professor than God, but I have not dared push my private egoism so far as to desist for its sake from the creation of the world." The joke's grandiosity should have alarmed Overbeck. It didn't quite register. 3 days later, another letter to his composer friend Peter Gast. "Sing me a new song. The world is transfigured and all the heavens rejoice." Then to another friend, "The world is transfigured, for God is on the earth. Do you not see how all the heavens rejoice? I have just taken possession of my empire." Then came January 3rd. The story that entered legend claims Nietzsche saw a coachman beating a horse on the Piazza Carlo Alberto. He rushed forward, threw his arms around the horse's neck, and collapsed sobbing. Whether this actually happened remains disputed. The account comes second-hand, documented days later. But it doesn't matter. Something broke that morning. What broke was everything. His landlord found him later that day in his room, incoherent. Nietzsche was at his piano, pounding out what he called divine music, singing incomprehensibly. When the landlord tried to calm him, Nietzsche claimed to be various historical figures, sometimes Christ, sometimes Dionysus, sometimes the spirit of Italy. The performance alternated between euphoria and terror, laughter and screaming. Desperate, the landlord sent telegrams to anyone whose address he could find in Nietzsche's papers. One reached Overbeck in Basel. It was brief, alarming. "Your friend ill. Come immediately." Overbeck caught the next train, arriving in Turin on January 7th. What he found horrified him. Nietzsche didn't recognize his old friend at first, calling him by various wrong names, speaking in disjointed fragments. When recognition flickered, Nietzsche would embrace Overbeck desperately, then retreat into incoherence. He alternated between claiming to be God and expressing terror about being executed. His eyes had a wild quality Overbeck had never seen. Present but not present, looking through rather than at things. The Fino family was relieved when Overbeck took responsibility. This strange German professor who'd seemed so normal had become frightening. They helped pack his few possessions, books, clothes, the manuscripts stacked neatly by his bed. Nietzsche sometimes cooperated, sometimes fought, sometimes went completely limp and had to be dressed like a child. Overbeck managed to get him onto a train back to Basel, a journey that must have been nightmarish. Nietzsche oscillated between docility and agitation, occasionally shouting, often weeping, sometimes falling into disturbed sleep. Other passengers stared. Overbeck tried to maintain dignity for both of them, but there was no dignifying madness on public transport. Basel's psychiatric clinic admitted him immediately. The initial diagnosis was progressive paralysis, medical terminology for tertiary syphilis affecting the brain. The disease would have been contracted years earlier, possibly decades, lying dormant before attacking the central nervous system. It fit the symptoms, the deteriorating mental state, the grandiose delusions, the physical tremors that had worsened over recent months. Other theories would emerge over the years. Brain tumour. inherited neurological disease from his father, some form of bipolar disorder exacerbated by years of overwork and isolation. The truth is, we'll never know with certainty. What's certain is that on January 3rd, 1889, Friedrich Nietzsche's productive life ended. He was 44 years old. Word reached his mother Franziska in Naumburg, then his sister Elizabeth in Paraguay. Franziska arranged for Friedrich's transfer from Basel to a clinic in Jena, closer to home. She was 63, in poor health herself, suddenly responsible for a son who couldn't recognize her and required constant supervision. Elizabeth, receiving the news in distant Paraguay where her husband's Aryan colony was collapsing, saw opportunity alongside tragedy. Her brother was famous enough to be interesting, incapacitated enough to be controllable. She began planning her return to Germany, already calculating how his papers might be managed, his legacy shaped. The letters she wrote from Paraguay mixed sisterly concern with something colder, assessment of assets, planning for influence. The diagnosis of tertiary syphilis was never definitively confirmed but became the accepted explanation. It made sense medically. The long incubation period, the specific pattern of mental deterioration, the physical symptoms, it also carried moral implications Nietzsche's enemies would exploit. The great immoralist brought low by sexual indiscretion, divine punishment for attacking Christianity. But there's another possibility, harder to prove, that Nietzsche's mind simply broke under the weight of thoughts too dangerous to think alone, that spending years pushing philosophical inquiry into territories nobody had explored, questioning everything, affirming existence despite its horror, that this psychological burden, combined with chronic illness, isolation, and overwork, shattered something fundamental. The philosopher who'd spent his life celebrating strength, will, and self-overcoming now couldn't recognize his own name. The mind that had thought thoughts too dangerous for his century went silent, trapped in a body that would live another 11 years. What should have been Nietzsche's triumph, recognition, readers, influence, would instead belong to his sister, who had very different plans for his legacy. Enter Elizabeth Förster Nietzsche, stage right, with a forger's pen and a nationalist agenda. While Nietzsche sat in an armchair by the window, unable to speak coherently, his sister Elizabeth was busy reinventing him. She'd always been a problem, a committed anti-Semite who'd married a more committed anti-Semite, tried founding an Aryan colony in the Paraguayan jungle, and returned to Germany after its spectacular failure and her husband's suicide. Now, with her famous brother incapacitated and their mother aging, Elizabeth saw opportunity. The Nietzsche archive, she decided, would be her empire. The truth would be her first casualty. To understand what Elizabeth did to her brother's legacy, you need to understand who Elizabeth was. Born in 1846, 2 years after Friedrich, she'd grown up in the same pious household, but drew opposite conclusions from it. Where Friedrich rebelled against Christianity and German nationalism, Elizabeth embraced both with fervour. She was intelligent, ambitious, and limited by the fact that Victorian Germany offered women few outlets for either quality. Managing her brilliant brother's affairs became her substitute career. Their relationship had always been complicated. As children, they were close, Friedrich writing plays for Elizabeth to perform, Elizabeth worshipping her older brother's cleverness. But as Friedrich's philosophy developed, the gap widened. He despised anti-Semitism as the mark of weak minds needing scapegoats. She embraced it as self-evident truth. He saw German nationalism as dangerous herd mentality. She considered it cultural pride. By the 1880s, they could barely discuss anything substantial without arguing. Then came Bernhard, Förster. Förster was a high school teacher who'd been fired for organising anti-Semitic student boycotts of Jewish-owned businesses. Undeterred, he became a full-time agitator, giving speeches about the Jewish threat to German purity, collecting signatures for petitions demanding Jewish deportation. He was handsome, charismatic, and utterly committed to racial ideology. Elizabeth, meeting him at an anti-Semitic convention in 1883, fell immediately in love. Nietzsche, learning of the engagement, was appalled. His letters to Elizabeth during this period mixed fraternal affection with barely controlled fury. He called Förster one of those ambitious nothings, warned Elizabeth she was throwing her life away on a fanatic, and pleaded with her to reconsider. She ignored him, marrying Förster in May 1885. Nietzsche attended the wedding but made his disapproval clear. The rift never healed. Worse was yet to come. Förster, facing limited prospects in Germany where his anti-Semitism was conventional rather than distinctive, hatched a scheme, Nueva Germania, a pure Aryan colony in Paraguay. He'd purchased land in the jungle, recruit proper German families, and build a community free from Jewish and indigenous contamination. The plan was delusional on every level. Förster knew nothing about agriculture, Paraguay's climate, or colonial administration. But he could sell dreams. 14 German families followed the Försters to Paraguay in 1886, investing their savings in Förster's vision. What they found was jungle, heat, disease, and isolation. The land Förster had purchased sight unseen was nearly uninhabitable. Crops failed. Disease spread. The colonists, realizing they'd been sold fantasy, grew mutinous. Förster, watching his dream collapse and debts accumulate, grew desperate. Elizabeth tried to manage the disaster. She wrote cheerful letters back to Germany describing Nueva Germania's success while privately facing catastrophe. She travelled to German-speaking communities trying to recruit more colonists, always needing more people, more money, more belief to sustain the illusion. But reality was undefeated. By 1889, Förster understood the colony would fail and drag his reputation down with it. In June 1889, with debts crushing him and colonists openly hostile, Bernhard Förster drank a mixture of morphine and strychnine. He died slowly, in agony, having gambled everything on racial purity in the jungle and lost. Elizabeth, left with a failed colony and her husband's corpse, faced a choice: stay in Paraguay admitting defeat, or return to Germany and reinvent the narrative. She chose reinvention. News of Friedrich's collapse reached her in Paraguay that January, shortly before Förster's suicide. The timing, from Elizabeth's perspective, was almost fortunate. Her Paraguayan disaster could be framed as noble sacrifice interrupted by family crisis. She could return to Germany not as a failure, but as a devoted sister rushing to care for her famous brother. She began planning immediately, but she didn't rush. Elizabeth stayed in Paraguay through 1889 and into 1890, managing the colony's dissolution and her husband's affairs. This wasn't sisterly neglect, it was calculation. Her mother Franziska was handling Friedrich's care adequately. Elizabeth's time was better spent in Paraguay, ensuring her version of events, the noble colony brought low by unworthy colonists and bad luck, became the official story. She finally returned to Germany in late 1890, full of plans. Friedrich was installed in their mother's house in Naumburg, cared for by nurses and Franziska. He sat, stared, occasionally played piano from muscle memory, recognized nobody. Franziska, exhausted by 2 years of caring for him, welcomed Elizabeth's help with relief that would prove tragically misplaced. Elizabeth quickly assessed the situation. Friedrich was famous enough to be interesting. His books were starting to sell better. Intellectuals across Europe discussed his ideas. But he was incapacitated enough to be controllable. His papers, manuscripts, letters, and unpublished writings represented valuable intellectual property. And Franziska, aging and overwhelmed, would gladly cede authority. In 1894, Elizabeth founded the Nietzsche Archive. The name itself was strategic. Not Elizabeth's archive or the Förster archive, but the Nietzsche Archive, as if it were Friedrich's official repository rather than Elizabeth's personal fiefdom. She installed it first in Naumburg, later moving it to Weimar, where Goethe and Schiller lent cultural prestige. The archive would preserve Friedrich's legacy, she announced. What she meant was it would package his legacy for maximum profit and ideological utility. Her first major project was assembling the will to power. Nietzsche had used this phrase in his late writings and notebooks, describing it as a fundamental drive in all life. Elizabeth decided it should be his magnum opus, the systematic philosophy that would crown his career. One problem: no such book existed. Undeterred, Elizabeth began assembling one. She gathered Friedrich's notebooks, thousands of pages of unpublished fragments written over decades. Some were developed thoughts, others were passing observations, preliminary sketches, ideas he'd explicitly rejected in later work. Elizabeth, with help from editors she could control, began selecting fragments, arranging them, sometimes editing or combining passages to create coherent arguments Friedrich had never actually made. The Will to Power first appeared in 1901. 8 volumes of notebook excerpts arranged into a false systematic philosophy. Elizabeth presented it as Nietzsche's intended masterpiece, interrupted by his collapse. Scholars who knew better, who understood you couldn't treat rough notebook jottings as finished philosophy, objected. Elizabeth ignored them. She controlled the papers, the archive, and increasingly, her brother's public image. The forgery went deeper. Elizabeth edited Friedrich's letters before publishing them, removing passages critical of Wagner, softening his attacks on German nationalism, deleting his contemptuous dismissals of anti-Semitism. She claimed to be correcting errors or removing material that would confuse readers. What she was doing was rewriting Friedrich's voice to align with her ideology. She also began cultivating relationships with influential Germans who shared her nationalistic views. The archive became a salon where philosophers, politicians, and cultural figures gathered to discuss Nietzsche under Elizabeth's guidance. She served tea, showed them Friedrich's manuscripts, and shaped their interpretations. The archive's success depended on seeming important, and seeming important required important visitors. Meanwhile, Friedrich sat in the next room. Visitors to the archive in the 1890s would occasionally glimpse him, led by nurses on short walks, sitting by a window, sometimes brought into the salon when Elizabeth wanted to display him. He'd sit passively while Elizabeth and her guests discussed his philosophy as if he weren't there. Occasionally he'd moan or make incomprehensible sounds. Mostly he just stared, present but absent, the living corpse of genius. The cruelty of it was extraordinary, but not intentionally sadistic. Elizabeth genuinely believed she was honouring her brother by making him famous, by ensuring his work survived. That she was simultaneously distorting that work to serve political purposes she'd have despised didn't register as contradiction. In her mind, she was saving Friedrich from obscurity and from himself, from his dangerous anti-German, anti-nationalist, anti-Christian ideas that would alienate readers if presented undiluted. Her mother Franziska died in 1897, leaving Elizabeth sole authority over Friedrich and his papers. The archive's control became absolute. Elizabeth could publish what she wanted, suppress what she didn't, edit as she saw fit. Scholars seeking access to Nietzsche's unpublished writings had to negotiate with her, accept her framing, or be denied entirely. And the strategy worked. By 1900, Nietzsche was becoming genuinely famous. His books sold in the thousands, discussed in universities and literary circles across Europe. Much of this had nothing to do with Elizabeth. The books spoke for themselves once people actually read them. But Elizabeth's archive controlled the narrative, shaped the public image, and increasingly presented Nietzsche as a proto-German nationalist thinker, rather than the German nationalism's critic he'd actually been. The supreme irony: the philosopher who'd valued truth above everything, who'd called intellectual honesty the highest virtue, who'd warned against letting ideology corrupt thought, this philosopher's legacy was being systematically falsified by the person who claimed to love him most. Elizabeth would guard her brother's corpse, both literal and literary, for 4 more decades after his death, entertaining fascists and philosophers alike in her archive, always controlling the narrative, always editing, always managing. The philosopher who'd warned against herd morality was being posthumously enrolled in the very nationalist movement he'd despised. Nietzsche himself, past caring, sat in his chair by the window, occasionally moaning wordlessly, sometimes playing simple melodies on the piano when led there by nurses. His magnificent moustache had grown wilder, gone completely white. His eyes stared at nothing in particular. The mind that had tried to think beyond good and evil was gone, leaving only the body, the breathing furniture Elizabeth arranged for maximum dramatic effect when important visitors came. August 25th, 1900, Naumburg. The silence finally came. For 11 years, Friedrich Nietzsche lived in what doctors called a twilight state, neither fully alive nor mercifully dead. His mother Franziska cared for him until her own death in 1897. Then Elizabeth took over, occasionally displaying him to visitors like a tragic museum piece. He sat, stared, sometimes played simple melodies on the piano from muscle memory alone. The man who'd written "Become Who You Are" had become nobody at all. The routine of care was grinding, repetitive, occasionally heartbreaking. Nurses fed him, dressed him, led him on short walks when weather permitted. He could manage basic physical functions but required supervision constantly. Sometimes he'd speak, but the words made no sense. Fragments of Italian mixed with German, names from his childhood, philosophical terms stripped of context. Whether these were glimpses of the mind beneath or merely random neural firing, nobody could say. Franziska, despite her age and exhaustion, maintained hope. She kept his room clean, made sure he was comfortable, spoke to him gently even when he gave no sign of understanding. She was 70 when he collapsed, hardly equipped for round-the-clock care of an invalid son, but she managed through sheer maternal stubbornness. Her letters from this period to Elizabeth in Paraguay mixed practical updates about Friedrich's condition with weariness that bled through even her carefully composed sentences. Occasionally she reported moments that seemed almost lucid. Friedrich would look directly at her and say, "Mother," clearly, as if surfacing briefly from deep water. Or he'd play a Schumann piece on the piano exactly right, every note perfect, before lapsing back into confusion. These moments kept her hoping for recovery that would never come. She died in April 1897 at 71, worn out from caring for her son. Her last words reportedly were about Friedrich, instructions to Elizabeth about his medication schedule. The woman who'd raised the pastor's son, who became philosophy's most dangerous heretic, never fully understood what her son had written, but she'd loved him faithfully through everything: his rebellion against Christianity, his academic scandal, his exile, his madness. That counted for more than understanding. Elizabeth's care was different. She arrived from Paraguay with plans, not just devotion. Friedrich became part of the archive's presentation, the living proof of genius destroyed by overwork or syphilis or whatever story served the narrative. When important visitors came, she'd sometimes bring them to see him, explaining how the great mind had burned too brightly and consumed itself. The visitors would stare, uncomfortable, while Nietzsche sat unaware of being observed. His physical condition deteriorated gradually but inexorably. A series of small strokes in 1898 left his right side partially paralysed. The paralysis spread slowly over the next 2 years. By 1900, he required help with nearly everything: eating, walking, basic hygiene. His weight dropped to barely 100 pounds. The magnificent moustache remained, now completely white, maintained by whoever was caring for him that day. Pneumonia arrived in August 1900, not for the first time, but finally with fatal effect. His weakened body, bedridden now, couldn't fight the infection. Breathing grew laboured. Consciousness, such as it was, faded further. Elizabeth stayed close, taking notes for the memoir she was already planning. On August 25th, surrounded by nurses and his sister, Friedrich Nietzsche stopped breathing. He was 55 years old. The death certificate listed the cause as pneumonia, with progressive paralysis noted as contributory. No autopsy was performed. Elizabeth wanted her brother buried quickly, properly, with the dignity that would befit the archive's most important asset. Questions about syphilis or inherited neurological disease were left deliberately vague. Better to maintain mystery than to investigate truths that might prove embarrassing. They buried him in Röcken, the tiny village where he was born, where his father the pastor lay in the cemetery beside the church. The funeral was full of irony sharp enough to cut. A Christian burial service for the man who'd declared God dead. Hymns sung over the coffin of philosophy's anti-Christian. A Lutheran pastor, a colleague of Friedrich's long-dead father, delivering remarks about eternal rest for the soul of someone who'd spent his life arguing souls didn't exist. The mourners were few but notable. Peter Gast came weeping openly. A handful of scholars who'd corresponded with Nietzsche attended, along with some local residents who remembered the family. Elizabeth stage-managed everything, dressed in black, receiving condolences with practiced grief. She'd already begun shaping the narrative. Her brilliant brother, destroyed by genius, now at peace. The obituaries in German papers were respectful but confused. They noted Nietzsche's philosophical contributions without quite understanding them. The Neue Freie Presse called him one of the most original thinkers of the century, while admitting his ideas remained controversial and often incomprehensible. The Berliner Tageblatt focused on his classical philology background, as if that were his main achievement. Only a few notices mentioned Thus Spoke Zarathustra, or his critique of morality, and those that did treated them as interesting oddities rather than revolutionary philosophy. The gravestone bore simple facts. Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche, October 15, 1844, August 25, 1900. No quotes from Zarathustra, no mention of philosophy, no acknowledgement that the man beneath that stone had tried to revalue all values and rewrite Western thought. Just a name, dates, and silence. They buried him in the same cemetery where his father the pastor lay, where little Friedrich had played among the gravestones as a child. The Lutheran service committed his body to earth with prayers about resurrection and eternal life. The very concepts he'd spent his productive years arguing were humanity's most dangerous illusions. The local pastor spoke about God's mysterious ways, about suffering as refinement, about heaven's reward. Everything Nietzsche had diagnosed as slave morality got performed over his coffin while Elizabeth nodded approvingly. After the service, Elizabeth returned to Weimar and her archive, already planning the expanded edition of The Will to Power, already drafting the biography that would shape her brother's image for decades. The philosopher who'd warned against herd conformity was about to be packaged for mass consumption. The thinker who'd valued intellectual honesty above all would be systematically misrepresented by the person who claimed to know him best. But the dead philosopher's ideas refused to stay buried. Within a decade, his books would be selling thousands of copies annually. Within 2 decades, his name would be associated with cultural movements across Europe. Within 3 decades, his ideas would be catastrophically misappropriated by the worst political movement in European history. The irony would have pleased him, or horrified him, or maybe both at once. Hard to say what the dead think, and Nietzsche had been effectively dead since 1889. What lived on was the work, dangerous, brilliant, endlessly misunderstood, impossible to ignore. The irony was exquisite. Nietzsche, who'd spent his life being ignored, became famous the moment he died. By 1910, everyone was reading him, or thought they were. Socialists saw a rebel against capitalism. Anarchists saw a destroyer of authority. Artists saw liberation from convention. And Elizabeth, smiling in her Weimar archive, made sure the German nationalists saw a prophet of cultural renewal and German superiority. The philosopher who'd warned that those who fight monsters should be careful not to become monsters was being turned into exactly the monster he'd warned against. The transformation began almost immediately after his death. Sales of Nietzsche's books, which had languished throughout his lifetime, suddenly accelerated. Beyond Good and Evil went through multiple printings. Thus, Spoke Zarathustra, which had sold perhaps 1,000 copies total before 1900, now sold thousands per year. The Gay Science found readers who actually understood the "God is dead" passage wasn't celebration, but diagnosis of a crisis. Part of this was simply timing. Europe in the 1900s was experiencing rapid social change, industrialization, urbanization, the erosion of traditional religious authority. Nietzsche's philosophy, which addressed exactly these conditions, suddenly felt relevant rather than merely eccentric. He'd been writing for this moment all along, predicting it, trying to prepare people for what came after God's death. Now the death was undeniable, and readers needed guidance. But the other part was Elizabeth's work. The Will to Power appeared in its expanded edition in 1906, 8 volumes of carefully selected and arranged notebook fragments, presented as Nietzsche's systematic philosophy. Scholars who knew better objected. Most readers didn't know better. They accepted Elizabeth's version as authentic, treating the book as Nietzsche's magnum opus, rather than his sister's creative editing project. The book seemed to offer what Nietzsche's actual published works deliberately avoided: system, clarity, definitive answers. Here was Will to Power explained as a metaphysical principle rather than a complex psychological observation. Here was the Übermensch defined in ways Nietzsche had carefully left ambiguous. Readers who found Thus Spoke Zarathustra too poetic and Beyond Good and Evil too aphoristic could turn to the Will to Power for straightforward philosophy. That it wasn't actually Nietzsche's philosophy in any coherent sense didn't matter to most readers. The book existed, bore Nietzsche's name, came from the official archive. It must be authentic. Elizabeth had succeeded in her forgery not through skill, but through sheer audacity and control of the source material. The interpretations that emerged were wildly contradictory, which in some sense proved Nietzsche's point about perspectivism. Everyone read him through their own lens. German nationalists found validation for cultural supremacy, ignoring Nietzsche's explicit attacks on German nationalism. Individualist anarchists found philosophical justification for rejecting all authority, overlooking Nietzsche's critique of anarchism as just another herd morality. artists found permission to break every rule, missing his careful analysis of what made rule-breaking meaningful versus merely chaotic. Georg Simmel, the Berlin sociologist, saw Nietzsche as diagnosing modernity's fragmentation. Stefan George, the German poet, treated Zarathustra as aesthetic scripture, founding a quasi-religious circle that met to read passages aloud. Thomas Mann wrestled with Nietzsche throughout his career, recognizing the philosophy's dangerous allure while suspecting its political implications. Each reader constructed a different Nietzsche, and most constructions were partly right and partly wrong. Academic philosophy was slower to embrace him. German university departments, still dominated by systematic neo-Kantians, found Nietzsche's aphoristic style and lack of formal arguments frustrating. How could you engage philosophically with someone who wrote like a prophet? Where were the premises, the logical deductions, the careful definitions? Nietzsche had deliberately abandoned these tools, but academic philosophers weren't sure how to proceed without them. A few brave souls tried. In 1908, Alois Riel published a study arguing Nietzsche belonged in the philosophical canon despite his unconventional style. Georg Simmel lectured on Nietzsche at Berlin, treating him as seriously as Kant or Hegel. Slowly, carefully, the Academy began accepting that you could philosophize without following traditional forms, that aphorism and provocation could be legitimate philosophical methods. Meanwhile, translations were spreading Nietzsche beyond German-speaking Europe. English translations began appearing in the 1890s, accelerating after 1900. The quality varied wildly. Some translators understood philosophy, others simply rendered German sentences into English without grasping the concepts. Key terms got mistranslated in ways that would haunt Nietzsche's reception for decades. Übermensch became Superman, with all the wrong superhero connotations. Herrenmoral became master morality, suggesting aristocratic privilege rather than Nietzsche's complex psychological analysis. French translations appeared next, and French intellectuals embraced Nietzsche with particular enthusiasm. Henry Lichtenberger's 1898 Study introduced Nietzsche to French readers as a philosopher of life against decadence, of affirmation against nihilism. The interpretation caught on quickly. By 1910, Parisian intellectuals quoted Nietzsche as readily as they quoted Voltaire, finding in his work a continental alternative to Anglo-American pragmatism and empiricism. The artistic embrace was perhaps most enthusiastic. Expressionist painters saw Nietzsche as validating their break from representational art. Composers like Richard Strauss, no relation to Wagner's circle, set Zarathustra to music in tone poems that became wildly popular. Dancers like Isadora Duncan interpreted Nietzsche's Dionysian philosophy through movement that scandalized conventional audiences. The Italian futurists claimed Nietzsche as their prophet of creative destruction, though their reading was more enthusiastic than accurate. Each artistic movement found something different in Nietzsche's work. The expressionists emphasized the Dionysian, the destructive creative force that broke through bourgeois conventions. The symbolists focused on Zarathustra's poetic language, its myths and parables. The futurists loved the rhetoric of overcoming, of smashing old values to create new ones. All of them were responding to real elements in Nietzsche's philosophy, but each emphasized different aspects while ignoring others. The reduction of Nietzsche to slogans began almost immediately. God is dead appeared on everything from book covers to cafe walls, usually without the surrounding context about what God's death meant and implied. What does not kill me makes me stronger became a motivational phrase, stripped of Nietzsche's complex analysis of suffering and growth. Become who you are turned into self-help advice, losing its philosophical depth about creating values in a meaningless universe. Nietzsche would have been horrified and probably unsurprised. He'd written extensively about how ideas get simplified when they spread, how slogans replace thought. His own philosophy was undergoing exactly this process, becoming popular by becoming less challenging, more quotable, easier to consume without actually having to change your thinking. Elizabeth encouraged the simplification. Complex, difficult Nietzsche was hard to sell. Nietzsche the prophet of German greatness, Nietzsche the apostle of strength, Nietzsche the destroyer of Jewish-Christian slave morality. These versions were much more marketable to pre-WWI German audiences. She gave interviews emphasizing her brother's Germanness, his connection to Wagner, carefully omitting their break, his critique of decadence. The archive became a pilgrimage site for German nationalists seeking philosophical validation. Not everyone was fooled. Some scholars who'd known Nietzsche personally, like Franz Overbeck, tried to correct the record. They published letters showing Nietzsche's contempt for anti-Semitism and nationalism. They pointed out the forgeries and distortions in The Will to Power. They argued for reading Nietzsche's actual published works rather than Elizabeth's reconstructions. But they were fighting a losing battle. Elizabeth controlled the archive, the unpublished papers, and the narrative. She could simply deny access to scholars who challenged her version. And most readers weren't scholars. They were educated Germans reading Nietzsche in cheap editions, encountering him through summaries and quotations, forming impressions based on reputation rather than careful study. The pre-war years saw Nietzsche's reputation reach a strange peak. He was simultaneously philosophy's most controversial figure and one of its most widely read. University professors debated whether he was a serious thinker or a dangerous charlatan. Artists celebrated him as liberator, while conservatives condemned him as symptom of cultural decline. Socialists claimed him, nationalists claimed him, individualists claimed him. Everyone wanted a piece of the dead philosopher who'd predicted modernity's crisis. Thomas Mann captured the ambivalence in his 1909 essay, Nietzsche's Philosophy in the Light of Contemporary Events. Mann recognized Nietzsche's brilliance while worrying about his cultural impact. The philosophy was seductive, Mann argued, but potentially dangerous if misunderstood, and it was constantly being misunderstood. The critique of Christian morality could liberate or justify cruelty, depending on who was reading. The emphasis on strength could inspire self-overcoming or excuse domination. By 1914, Nietzsche had become whatever anyone needed him to be. The philosopher who'd valued truth above all else was now the most misunderstood thinker in Europe. His books sold in the thousands, his name dropped at dinner parties, his ideas mangled beyond recognition. The careful arguments about morality's genealogy became crude claims about strong versus weak. The subtle analysis of nihilism and its overcoming became simplistic celebration of power. Somewhere, in whatever philosophical afterlife might exist, Nietzsche was probably laughing or screaming or both. He'd spent his life trying to get people to think differently, to question their most basic assumptions. Instead, they'd turned him into another authority figure, another dead German thinker whose ideas could be quoted without being understood, whose provocations could be domesticated into conventional wisdom. The trenches of World War I would soon give the world plenty of reasons to reconsider everything, including what they thought Nietzsche had meant. Soldiers would carry Thus Spoke Zarathustra into battle alongside their Bibles, finding in it something to believe in, or at least something to read while waiting to die. The war would discredit so much of European culture that Nietzsche's critique of that culture would seem prescient rather than merely provocative. But before any of that clarity could emerge, before the war could force honest reckoning with what European civilization had become, something else would happen. Something worse than misunderstanding, worse than simplification, worse than the philosophical appropriations of the pre-war years. Then came the Nazis, and the laughing stopped. In 1934, Adolf Hitler visited the Nietzsche archive in Weimar. Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche, now 88 and thrilled to have such an important guest, presented the Führer with her brother's walking stick. A photograph captured the moment. Hitler reverent before Nietzsche's bust, Elisabeth beaming, the philosopher's reputation about to be buried under a swastika. The Nazis had found their thinker. Never mind that Nietzsche had despised anti-Semitism, nationalism, and everything German fascism represented. The Nazi appropriation of Nietzsche didn't happen overnight. It had been building throughout the 1920s as far-right intellectuals searched for philosophical justification in German tradition. Nietzsche seemed perfect. He'd attacked Christianity, praised strength, criticized democracy, and used words like Übermensch and will to power that sounded appropriately martial and superior. That these concepts meant something completely different in context was inconvenient, so context was simply ignored. Alfred Baumler, a Nazi philosopher appointed to a Berlin professorship in 1933, led the ideological reconstruction. His 1931 book Nietzsche. Philosopher and politician presented the philosopher as proto-fascist prophet of Aryan supremacy. Baumler's method was simple. Quote passages about strength and power, ignore passages about individual freedom and intellectual honesty, and claim the will to power, Elizabeth's fabrication, as Nietzsche's true systematic philosophy. The result was Nietzsche as Nazi philosopher, complete with academic credentials. Elizabeth, for her part, was delighted. The Nazis represented everything she'd believed her entire life. German nationalism, racial purity, contempt for democracy, and degenerate modern culture. That they also represented everything her brother had opposed didn't trouble her. She convinced herself Friedrich would have approved, that his attacks on herd morality were really attacks on Jewish influence, that his Übermensch concept obviously meant Aryan Superman. Hitler's visits to the archive became regular events. He came in 1934, returned in 1935, brought Mussolini in 1937 to show off Germany's philosophical heritage. Elizabeth treated these visits as validations, proof that she'd been right about her brother's significance all along. She gave Hitler first editions of Nietzsche's books, showed him manuscripts, basked in the Führer's apparent philosophical interest. When Hitler spoke, she listened reverently, perhaps not noticing, or perhaps not caring that he clearly hadn't read the books carefully. Mussolini actually had. The Italian dictator was a more serious reader of philosophy than Hitler, and had compiled a Nietzsche anthology in the 1920s. In 1934 he presented Hitler with a lavish edition of Nietzsche's complete works, 24 volumes, specially bound, a gift between fascist leaders celebrating their shared philosophical inspiration. The irony was rich enough to choke on, two dictators bonding over a philosopher who'd written that the state is the coldest of all cold monsters. The distortion operated at every level. The Übermensch, Nietzsche's complex ideal of someone who could create values and affirm existence without God, became simply the Aryan Superman, biologically superior, racially pure, destined to dominate inferior peoples. Will to power, Nietzsche's description of life's drive toward growth and self-overcoming, became crude justification for military conquest and political domination. Eternal recurrence, that thought experiment about affirming every moment of your life, was ignored entirely because it didn't serve fascist purposes. Every quote got twisted. What does not kill me makes me stronger, justified brutality. Live dangerously became a slogan for military aggression. Beyond good and evil meant transcending humanitarian concerns when pursuing national greatness. Nazi ideologues mined Nietzsche's works for anything that sounded martial, strong or contemptuous of weakness, then stripped away all context and philosophical nuance. The actual Nietzsche would have been appalled. His writings were full of explicit rejections of everything the Nazis embodied. He'd broken with Wagner specifically over anti-Semitism, calling it a sign of weak and obscure instincts. He'd attacked German nationalism repeatedly, once writing that Germans were becoming stupider and stupider through their political unification. He despised herd mentality of any kind, which made fascism's mass movements exactly what he'd warned against. He valued individual conscience and intellectual honesty above everything, precisely what totalitarianism destroyed first. But these inconvenient passages were simply ignored or explained away. When Nazi publishers printed Nietzsche, they emphasized sections that fit their ideology and quietly omitted sections that didn't. When scholars pointed out the contradictions, they were dismissed as Jewish intellectuals or decadent cosmopolitans who couldn't understand authentic German philosophy. Elizabeth, when pressed, would claim Friedrich had been misunderstood in his lifetime and only now was being properly appreciated. She died in November 1935, shortly after Hitler's final visit, having lived just long enough to see her brother's reputation fully annexed by fascism. Her funeral was a Nazi spectacle, swastika banners, uniformed guards, speeches about German cultural greatness. They buried her in Röcken beside Friedrich, the anti-Semite next to the anti-anti-Semite, the nationalist beside the anti-nationalist, united in death as they never were in life. The archive continued under Nazi management. Alfred Rosenberg, chief Nazi ideologist, appointed loyal scholars to oversee Nietzsche publications. They produced editions emphasizing the will to power and downplaying works like Human, All Too Human, that were too critical, too cosmopolitan, too explicitly anti-nationalist. German soldiers carried Thus Spoke Zarathustra into battle, reading it as scripture of strength. Hitler reportedly kept a copy on his nightstand, though whether he read it or simply displayed it remains unclear. The stains spread across Europe. As Germany conquered, Nietzsche's reputation came with them, now irrevocably associated with fascism. French intellectuals who'd embraced Nietzsche before the war scrambled to distance themselves. British thinkers who'd found him interesting now called him dangerous. The philosopher who'd wanted to think beyond good and evil was being called the root of evil itself. When Allied forces reached Weimar in April 1945, they found the Nietzsche archive packed with Nazi memorabilia, photographs of Hitler's visits, correspondence between Elizabeth and party officials. The association was undeniable, documented in the archive's own files. American officers, disgusted, considered destroying the entire collection. Cooler heads prevailed, but the damage to Nietzsche's reputation was catastrophic and permanent. The philosopher who'd wanted to overcome nationalism had become its symbol. The man who'd called anti-Semitism a sign of weak character was now associated with genocide. The thinker who'd written "Every profound spirit needs a mask" had been given the ugliest mask imaginable, and millions believed it was his true face. It would take decades of scholarship to separate Nietzsche from the Nazis, and some would argue the stain never fully washed away. But then came a new generation of readers, armed with better texts and fewer agendas, ready to reconsider what the philosopher had actually said. The 1960s discovered Nietzsche wasn't a Nazi after all, and promptly made him a different kind of rebel. This time, the philosopher of the hammer became the patron saint of postmodernism, existentialism's dark uncle, and the academic superstar who made it respectable to question everything. Michel Foucault called him inescapable. Jacques Derrida built entire theories from his footnotes. College students put "God is dead" on dorm room posters, usually without understanding what came after that declaration. The dead philosopher was having his moment, several decades late, but better late than never. The rehabilitation began with Walter Kaufmann, a Princeton professor who'd fled Nazi Germany and had particular motivation to separate Nietzsche from fascism. His 1950 book, Nietzsche, Philosopher, Psychologist, Antichrist, systematically dismantled the Nazi interpretation. Kaufmann showed, with careful textual evidence, that Nietzsche had explicitly rejected anti-Semitism, nationalism, and German cultural supremacy. He revealed the will to power as Elizabeth's forgery, demonstrated how quotes had been twisted, and translated Nietzsche's works with attention to philosophical accuracy rather than ideological agenda. The book was a revelation for English-speaking readers. Here was Nietzsche, the critic of all authority, including nationalist authority. Nietzsche, the cosmopolitan European who despised German provincialism. Nietzsche, the individualist who'd attacked herd mentality in all its forms, fascist included. Kaufmann's translations became standard, his interpretations canonical. The Nazi stain didn't disappear entirely, but it no longer obscured everything else. Meanwhile, in Paris, something stranger was happening. French philosophers in the 1960s discovered Nietzsche could be weaponized against different targets, not fascism this time, but the whole Western philosophical tradition's claims about truth, reason, and objective knowledge. Michel Foucault led the charge, his genealogical method, tracing how concepts like madness, sexuality, and punishment emerged historically rather than logically, came directly from Nietzsche's genealogy of morality. Foucault showed how power operated through knowledge, how what counted as truth was often whoever had institutional authority to define it. This was pure Nietzsche, truth as perspective, knowledge as power, morality as human invention serving human purposes. Jacques Derrida found in Nietzsche predecessor for deconstruction. Nietzsche's insight that language shapes thought, that metaphors harden into concepts we mistake for reality, that philosophy's truths often rest on unexamined linguistic assumptions. This became foundational for Derrida's project of showing how texts undermined their own claims to stable meaning. Gilles Deleuze wrote an entire book celebrating Nietzsche as philosopher of difference, becoming, and affirmation. Where traditional philosophy sought unity and stable essences, Nietzsche embraced multiplicity and change. Where others wanted systems, Nietzsche offered fragments and contradictions that refused systematic resolution. The French readings were brilliant, creative, and sometimes barely connected to what Nietzsche actually wrote. They were using him, appropriating him for their own philosophical projects, in ways that would have amused the dead philosopher. At least these appropriations came from careful readers rather than propagandists. The academic explosion followed. By the 1970s, Nietzsche studies had become its own industry. Conferences, journals, dissertations, everyone had a Nietzsche interpretation. Analytic philosophers tried making his arguments formally rigorous. Continental philosophers celebrated his resistance to systematization. Feminist scholars offered complex assessments of his problematic writings about women. Post-colonial theorists examined his Eurocentrism while appreciating his critique of universal reason. the contradictory interpretations continued, proof perhaps that Nietzsche had been right about perspectivism. Conservatives claimed him as defender of excellence and hierarchy. Leftists claimed him as critic of capitalist alienation. Libertarians loved his individualism. Communitarians pointed to his critique of atomized modern selves. Each reading found textual support because Nietzsche's works were genuinely complex, often contradictory, deliberately resistant to simple categorization. Popular culture caught up too, though often in ways that would have appalled academic Nietzsche scholars. Jim Morrison claimed Dionysian inspiration for The Doors. Lou Reed name-dropped Nietzsche in interviews about art and transgression. Robert Pirsig's Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance introduced millions to quality as Nietzsche-adjacent concept. God is Dead appeared on t-shirts, usually without the surrounding 500 pages of philosophy, explaining why that mattered. The phrase became cultural shorthand for secularization, modernization, the loss of absolute values, sometimes used seriously, often ironically. Everyone knew Nietzsche said God was dead. Fewer knew he'd also written that we'd killed God, and hadn't yet grasped the implications that we were still living on Christianity's credit while denying the debt. By the 1980s, you couldn't throw a semiotics textbook without hitting a Nietzsche reference. The philosopher who'd written for nobody was now required reading for everybody, or at least everybody pursuing a humanities degree. His warning that there are no facts, only interpretations, became the battle cry of a generation questioning objective truth, sometimes wisely, sometimes descending into relativistic confusion Nietzsche would have mocked. Academic journals filled with debates about whether Nietzsche was a relativist, a perspectivist, or something else entirely, whether his critique of truth was self-refuting, whether you could consistently reject universal morality while still making moral claims, whether his philosophy offered genuine liberation, or merely replaced one dogma with another. The arguments continue. The rehabilitation was incomplete but real. Nietzsche was no longer the Nazi philosopher but the postmodern prophet, the thinker who'd anticipated the death of grand narratives and the crisis of meaning in secular modernity. Whether that reputation was more accurate than the Nazi one remained debatable. At least it came from people who'd actually read the books, and then came the internet, and Nietzsche went viral. The 21st century made Nietzsche a meme, which he probably would have found both horrifying and hilarious. His moustache became an emoji. His quotes, often fake ones, circulated on Instagram alongside sunset photos and gym selfies. Self-help gurus quoted, "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger," without mentioning he probably got it wrong, that sometimes what doesn't kill you just makes you weaker and traumatized. Meanwhile, serious philosophers continued wrestling with his actual ideas, which remained as relevant and troubling as ever. The internet's Nietzsche bore only passing resemblance to the philosopher who'd walked alone through alpine meadows composing dangerous thoughts. Online, he became the mustached avatar of edgy profundity, his image slapped onto motivational posters about gym gains and entrepreneurial hustle. Live Dangerously appeared over photos of extreme sports. That which does not kill me makes me stronger became the rallying cry of everyone from cancer survivors to CrossFit enthusiasts, all claiming Nietzschean inspiration for very un-Nietzschean pursuits. The misquotes proliferated faster than corrections could spread. Without music, life would be a mistake. Actually Nietzsche. In heaven all the interesting people are missing, also real. God is dead and we have killed him. Simplified but essentially accurate. Be yourself, everyone else is already taken. Not Nietzsche, actually Oscar Wilde, but attributed to Nietzsche so often it became his in the popular imagination. Self-help books discovered Nietzsche could sell if properly domesticated. Titles like When Nietzsche Wept and What Would Nietzsche Do turned the philosopher into a life coach, offering practical advice about authenticity and resilience. The books meant well, often containing genuine insights, but they inevitably simplified. Nietzsche's careful analysis of nihilism and its overcoming became believe in yourself. His critique of herd morality became don't care what others think. The philosopher who'd spent his life trying to complicate comfortable certainties was being turned into comfortable certainties. Motivational speakers were even worse. Tony Robbins quoted Nietzsche on power and will, missing entirely that Nietzsche's will to power wasn't about dominating sales meetings. Business consultants used Beyond Good and Evil to justify ruthless negotiation tactics, apparently unaware Nietzsche was critiquing exactly that kind of instrumental thinking. The Ubermensch became the Uber-entrepreneur, crushing competition through sheer force of will and positive thinking. Yet academic philosophy continued taking Nietzsche seriously, producing increasingly sophisticated interpretations. Scholars debated his relationship to truth. Was he a relativist who thought all perspectives were equal, or a perspectivist who thought truth required multiple viewpoints? Did his critique of morality undermine itself, or did it establish new grounds for ethical thinking? Could you consistently reject universal values while still making value judgments? Feminist philosophers offered complex assessments. Nietzsche's writings about women were often appalling. He'd called women essentially deceptive, claimed they didn't understand truth, made jokes about whips in relationships. But his critique of fixed essences and universal natures also undermined biological essentialism. Some feminists found resources in Nietzsche for thinking beyond gender binaries. Others considered him unsalvageable, his occasional insights not worth the pervasive misogyny. Post-colonial theorists faced similar tensions. Nietzsche's Eurocentrism was undeniable. He barely considered non-European philosophies, made casual racist assumptions standard for his era. Yet his genealogical method, his critique of universal reason, his skepticism towards civilizing narratives, all proved useful for deconstructing colonial ideologies. You could use Nietzsche against Eurocentrism while acknowledging he'd been thoroughly Eurocentric himself. The philosopher's relevance to contemporary politics became unavoidable. Post-truth politics, where leaders dismissed factual claims as merely perspective, where alternative facts competed with evidence, seemed to vindicate Nietzsche's worst predictions about what happened when you killed truth without understanding the consequences. His diagnosis of nihilism, the condition where nothing seems to matter, where all values feel arbitrary, described the existential mood of many young people navigating precarious economies and climate catastrophe. Jordan Peterson complicated everything. The Canadian psychologist became a cultural phenomenon partly by popularizing his interpretation of Nietzsche, mixed with Jung and evolutionary psychology and self-help. Peterson's reading emphasized responsibility, meaning-making, and rejecting, victimhood. Not entirely wrong as Nietzsche interpretations go, but selective and often serving conservative political purposes Nietzsche would have found tedious. The controversy revealed how Nietzsche remained politically contested, claimed by left and right for contradictory purposes. Popular culture continued its love affair with Nietzschean themes. The Matrix trilogy explicitly engaged Nietzsche's questions about reality and choice. Breaking Bad explored what happened when a mild-mannered teacher decided to go beyond good and evil. True Detective's first season made cosmic pessimism fashionable again. Westworld interrogated consciousness and the will to power through android philosophy. Some of these engagements were superficial. Others showed genuine philosophical sophistication. New translations kept appearing, each claiming to finally get Nietzsche right. Adrian Del Caro's versions emphasized readability. Graham Park's focused on philosophical precision. Translators argued about single words. Should Übermensch be Overman, Superman, or left untranslated? Each choice-shaped interpretation proved how much philosophy happened at the level of language itself. Sales remained strong. Thus, Spoke Zarathustra still sold thousands of copies annually, mostly to college students and spiritual seekers treating it as secular scripture. Beyond Good and Evil attracted readers wanting rigorous philosophy. The genealogy of morality became required reading in ethics courses. Even the general reader could find accessible introductions, graphic novel adaptations, podcasts explaining Nietzsche's ideas. Through it all, multiple Nietzsches coexisted. The academic Nietzsche of scholarly conferences, the pop culture Nietzsche of motivational quotes, the meme Nietzsche of internet jokes, the self-help Nietzsche of airport bookstores. He'd probably appreciate the irony. The philosopher of perspectivism being interpreted from every conceivable perspective, his ideas refracted through countless lenses, none quite capturing the whole. Today, Nietzsche exists in these multiple simultaneous versions. He's the mustache provocateur on philosophy merchandise, the serious subject of PhD dissertations, the misquoted inspiration on Instagram, the misunderstood prophet invoked by people who haven't read past page 10 of Zarathustra. The man who announced God's death has achieved something like immortality, which, given his theory of eternal recurrence, might be exactly what he feared. The system he'd sought to shatter had instead absorbed him, turning revolutionary critique into just another lifestyle brand, another intellectual fashion, another dead philosopher safely contained by coffee mugs and tote bags. Whether this represented capitalism's ultimate triumph, or philosophy's persistence through any medium depended entirely on who you asked. But what did Nietzsche actually say? And why does it still matter? And that's the story of Friedrich Nietzsche, the pastor's son who declared God dead, the professor who abandoned academia for alpine solitude, the prophet who spoke to empty crowds, and the philosopher whose dangerous ideas finally found their audience a century too late, often in the wrong hands, for the wrong reasons. Before you drift off to sleep, let's retrace his extraordinary journey through the fog of history. We began in Reckon, where a pious boy grew up among gravestones and hymns, never suspecting he'd spent his life demolishing the Christian values that shaped his childhood. That young Nietzsche, brilliant, obedient, destined for the pulpit, would become the revolutionary who fled conventional thinking for the freedom to question everything: God, morality, truth itself. Then came the university years, the discovery of Schopenhauer's pessimism, the unprecedented professorship at 24, the intoxicating friendship with Wagner that ended in bitter disillusionment, the failed romance with Lou Salome that confirmed his isolation, and finally the wandering years, cheap boarding houses, constant pain, writing masterpieces nobody read while his health collapsed around him. Ah, those boarding houses. Picture him there, nearly blind, composing Thus Spoke Zarathustra beside that alpine lake, writing Beyond Good and Evil in Nice, hammering out his final books in Turin before his mind shattered completely. The philosopher who declared what doesn't kill me makes me stronger, learning that sometimes what doesn't kill you simply breaks you. After his collapse came the tragic coda, 11 years of silence while his sister rewrote his legacy, his death in 1900, the Nazi appropriation that made him a monster, the slow rehabilitation that made him a postmodern prophet, the internet age that made him a meme, each generation reinventing Nietzsche, finding what they needed or feared, rarely encountering the actual man behind the moustache. So, why does Nietzsche matter tonight? Because whether you're drifting off after questioning your life's meaning, or simply wondering why truth feels so slippery lately, his central question remains: how do we create meaning in a universe that offers none? How do we live honestly, courageously, without the comforting lies of religion or the false certainties of ideology? His answers were complex, often disturbing, frequently misunderstood. But his questions won't go away. Now, as the candle of history flickers low, let's leave Nietzsche where we found him, walking alone through alpine meadows, composing dangerous thoughts one excruciating step at a time, writing for readers who didn't exist yet but might someday understand. The rest, dear listener, is up to us. If these journeys into philosophy help you unwind, do us a kindness. Tap that like button, whisper subscribe, and leave a comment below. What stays with you about Nietzsche's story, and what philosophical ideas should we explore next? Now, close your eyes, let these ideas drift, and we'll meet again soon for another story. Sleep well.